A school dessert, strawberry shortcake, the kind of thing any child would eat without a second thought. That was exactly what, in early 1997, made hundreds of American children sick at the same time, in states that did not even border one another. And the problem was not the cake, or the cream, but specifically the strawberries used as the topping. The most disturbing part was that there was nothing unusual about the appearance of the fruit, no strange smell, nothing that any cafeteria worker could have noticed before serving it. And what makes this case even more remarkable is not just the number of children affected. It is how quickly authorities responded once the problem came to light, a striking contrast to other similar cases that took months, or even years to resolve. This one was brought under control within a matter of days. If you enjoy this kind of investigation, consider subscribing to the channel before we continue, because there are many more true cases like this one coming. In March 1997, schools in Calhoun County, Michigan, began reporting something unusual. Children and staff members from 4 different school districts started developing symptoms of hepatitis A, a disease that had barely been reported in the area during the previous year. This was not an isolated case at a single school. It was happening in several schools at the same time, with no obvious connection between them other than the fact that they all participated in the same federal school lunch program, funded by the United States Department of Agriculture. Programs like this distribute standardized food products to thousands of schools across the country, which was already an important detail, even though nobody realized it at first. At those schools, the strawberries were not served on their own. They were incorporated into a common dessert on American school menus, a type of strawberry shortcake in which thawed fruit was used as a topping or filling over a cake or biscuit base, along with a little cream. It was this exact dessert, served on cafeteria trays on different days over several weeks, that would later turn out to be the common link among nearly all of the children who became sick. The first cases seemed like nothing more than bad luck, an isolated outbreak with no clear source. But the number of sick children continued to grow, day after day, until it became clear that this required an investigation on a much larger scale than any single school district could handle on its own. Michigan health authorities asked the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the main federal agency responsible for disease control in the United States, for help on March 24, 1997. And here is one of the most remarkable details of the entire case. In just 3 days, by March 27, CDC investigators had already interviewed patients about their eating and hygiene habits and found a surprisingly consistent common denominator. Virtually all of those affected had eaten frozen strawberries, not fresh strawberries, served through the federal school lunch program. The investigation moved unusually fast for a case like this, largely because investigators carefully compared what each sick child had eaten in the days before their symptoms began with what classmates who did not become sick had eaten during the same period. It also became clear early on that it made no sense to blame a single cafeteria worker or an isolated hygiene problem inside the schools, since no specific employee had handled the fruit at every affected school. The problem had clearly started before the fruit ever reached the schools. With the frozen strawberries identified as the common food, investigators began tracing the exact origin of the product. The trail led to Andrew and Williamson Fresh Produce, a distributor based in San Diego, California, responsible for processing, packaging, and freezing strawberries for commercial use in large 28.7-pound containers, intended for institutional customers, including the federal school lunch program. 13 different lots of the strawberries, processed between April and May 1996, almost a year before the first symptoms appeared, had been shipped to Michigan in early December of that same year. That meant the contamination had occurred long before any child ever had that dessert placed on their tray. The strawberries remained frozen for months, stored and waiting for the moment when they would finally be used and served. But there is an important detail in this story. California was the origin of the product, not the location of the outbreak. The confirmed cases of hepatitis A occurred primarily in Michigan, which became the epicenter of the crisis, and in Maine, on the other side of the country. Additional cases were also identified in Wisconsin, Arizona, and Louisiana. California, despite receiving the same lot of strawberries, did not record any confirmed cases. Even so, authorities in Los Angeles decided to take preventive action because of the risk of exposure to the contaminated product. By this point, the question was no longer which food was causing the illnesses. That was already practically established. The real mystery was something else. Where exactly had those strawberries come from, and how had they become contaminated before they even reached the United States? The answer brought a twist that went far beyond a simple agricultural hygiene failure. The strawberries in that particular lot had not actually been grown in the United States, even though they had been distributed through the school lunch program with documentation identifying them as an American product. They had been grown in Mexico, imported improperly, and then processed by Andrew and Williamson Fresh Produce in California, which packaged and sold them as domestic strawberries, allowing the company to meet the requirements for supplying food to the federal program. At some point between being grown in Mexico and being processed in California, the hepatitis A virus contaminated the fruit, most likely through water used for irrigation or washing, or through contact with an infected worker during harvesting, a pattern of contamination similar to what investigators had seen in other outbreaks involving raw agricultural products. Fortunately, the impact on the children followed the relatively milder course that hepatitis A tends to have in young, otherwise healthy patients, although it was still far from a pleasant illness to endure. Symptoms included severe fatigue, nausea, abdominal pain, and loss of appetite, along with the dark urine and yellowing of the skin that are characteristic of liver inflammation in many cases. In total, 213 cases were confirmed in 23 schools across Michigan, with another 29 cases in 13 schools in Maine, on the other side of the country, all linked to the exact same strawberry lot through genetic testing that compared the viral material found in each patient. Additional cases also appeared in Wisconsin, Arizona, and Louisiana, all genetically identical to one another, proving that this was a single source of contamination that had been silently distributed to schools in at least 6 states. The technical culprit, the hepatitis A virus present in the contaminated fruit, was only half of the story. The other half involved a much more deliberate failure, the practice of importing strawberries from Mexico and selling them under documentation that presented them as produce grown in the United States, bypassing requirements of the federal school lunch program that, directly or indirectly, favored domestic products. This combination of commercial fraud and a genuine food safety failure turned what could have been an isolated agricultural contamination problem into a crisis that affected thousands of children at the same time, through a program that was supposed to follow strict traceability standards. When the Food and Drug Administration began tracing the lots back to Andrew and Williamson Fresh Produce, investigators identified approximately 992,000 pounds of strawberries that could have been contaminated, enough to have reached far more schools than those where cases actually appeared. In the end, the strawberries were removed from use on March 28, 1997, just 4 days after the initial request for help from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a response time considered exceptionally fast for this type of investigation. Even so, the concern quickly spread to other states that had received the same lot of fruit, even though they had not yet reported any illnesses. The most common response in these situations is the administration of immune globulin, a treatment very different from a traditional vaccine. Instead of waiting weeks for the body to learn how to defend itself against the virus, immune globulin provides ready-made antibodies, obtained from the blood plasma of donors who already have immunity, providing an immediate boost of protection. The problem is that this type of protection is only truly effective if it is given soon after exposure, generally within 2 weeks, which explains why health authorities were in such a hurry at the time. In Marshall, Michigan, the epicenter of the outbreak, the school district set up 3 emergency vaccination clinics and administered 2,000 doses of immune globulin in just 3 days, including to families who stood in line during school basketball games just to receive the treatment in time. In Los Angeles, after authorities discovered that portions of contaminated fruit had been served at 18 public schools, they offered the same preventive treatment to as many as 9,000 students and teachers, even though no cases had been confirmed in California at that point. Fred Williamson, president of Andrew and Williamson Fresh Produce, resigned just days after the scandal became public. No deaths were reported in connection with this particular outbreak, a relief given that most of those affected were school-aged children, whose bodies generally handle hepatitis A better than those of older adults or people with other health conditions. The case, however, exposed serious weaknesses in the food supply chain for federal programs, fueling a public debate over the need for a single federal agency responsible for food safety in the United States, rather than the division of responsibilities among multiple agencies that existed at the time, and, to a large extent, still exists today. Consumer advocacy groups even wrote directly to the White House calling for this structural change, arguing that contamination problems were moving faster than the government's ability to oversee and regulate the food supply. The outbreak also reinforced the importance of genetic sequencing of viruses as an epidemiological investigation tool, a technique that helped connect seemingly isolated cases in distant states to a single common source, a method that would become increasingly central to foodborne outbreak investigations in the decades that followed. The 1997 strawberry outbreak shows a side of this kind of tragedy that is often overlooked. When the response works quickly, the damage can be far smaller than in other similar cases. Even so, the root cause, fraud involving the origin of the product, combined with a genuine food safety failure, reinforces the fact that traceability and transparency throughout the food supply chain remain essential, even decades later. If you are interested in this kind of investigation, leave a comment telling me which other food safety case you would like to see covered here, and don't forget to share this video with someone who also likes to understand how these things really happen.